If you believe that true wealth lies not in what we keep, but in what we give, then you're in the right place. We shine a light on the quiet moments that reveal the best in people, the choices no one notices, but that change lives forever. So before we begin, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and stay with us until the end. Because today, a billionaire father, who thought he had seen it all, will witness a simple act of kindness, and realize he's the one with something left to learn. Richard Delaney didn't look like a billionaire that morning. He wore a simple navy jacket, dark jeans, and a pair of broken-in loafers that had once cost a fortune but now looked comfortably ordinary. His silver hair was combed back with little effort, and the only thing that gave him away, if anyone had been paying attention, was the way he carried himself. Calm, quiet, observant, like a man used to watching everything and missing nothing. He had flown into Kansas City the night before under a different name, checked into a modest hotel, and instructed his assistant not to contact him for 48 hours. No interviews, no meetings, no curated tours. He wanted the truth. And the only way to see the truth in his business was to see it like an ordinary man. That morning, he made his way to a local restaurant his company had acquired 2 years earlier, Harvest and Hearth, a cozy neighborhood diner tucked between a thrift store and an auto parts shop. It was the kind of place working families came to on Sundays after church or on Friday nights for meatloaf and mashed potatoes. The kind of place that didn't make headlines, but fed people who didn't have time for headlines. Richard pushed the door open and stepped inside, the soft jingle of the bell above announcing his arrival. The warm scent of brewed coffee, buttered toast, and sizzling bacon filled the air. Booths lined the walls, their cushions worn in all the right places. A few regulars looked up briefly before returning to their conversations. No one recognized him. Perfect. He approached the hostess stand, but before he could speak, something caught his eye, outside. A little boy, no older than 6, was standing on the sidewalk just past the entrance. He was slight and thin, with a mop of sandy blonde hair that looked like it hadn't been brushed in days. His coat was a size too big, and his cheeks were pink from the cold. But it wasn't his face or clothes that stopped Richard mid-sentence. It was the shoes. If they could still be called that. The boy's sneakers were torn beyond repair. The soles had pulled away from the front, revealing sockless toes. One shoe was tied together with a rubber band. The other was missing its laces altogether. The material was cracked, flapping with each step as if it begged to give up. And yet, the boy stood there, shifting his weight back and forth, trying to keep pace with his mother and sister, who were already inside. For a moment, Richard stood frozen, his hand still resting on the edge of the hostess stand. He had built his empire feeding America. From fast food to fine dining, his investments touched nearly every corner of the industry. He could recite profit margins, supplier contracts, seasonal trends, all from memory. He knew which franchises were struggling before the quarterly reports even landed on his desk. But there were things he didn't know. Like how many kids walked into his restaurants with shoes held together by rubber bands. The boy finally stepped through the doorway, holding onto his older sister's hand. They were led to a small corner booth near the back. A waitress in a green apron approached them with a warm smile and a notepad. Richard watched as the mother, thin, maybe in her early 30s, worry creased across her brow, muttered something about sharing one sandwich. He requested a seat with a clear view of their table. As he settled into his booth, Richard kept one eye on the menu and the other on the little boy's feet, dangling just above the floor. The boy kicked softly beneath the table, unaware of the attention. Every time he swung his legs, the frayed toe of one shoe bent open like a broken mouth. It was a small thing. Insignificant, maybe, to anyone else. But to Richard Delaney, it felt like a siren. Quiet but unignorable. Haley Grant moved through the narrow aisles of the diner with the quiet confidence of someone who knew every squeaky tile and every regular's coffee preference by heart. At 26, she had worked full-time at Harvest and Hearth for nearly 5 years. It wasn't glamorous, and it definitely wasn't easy, but it was steady, and in her life, steady was gold. She wore her hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, her green apron neatly pressed, and a ballpoint pen tucked behind one ear. Her sneakers were scuffed from long shifts, and her name tag had been replaced twice already. Most days, she didn't mind the hustle. She liked making people feel taken care of, even if it was just for the length of a meal. But today, something tugged at her differently. She had just delivered pancakes to an elderly couple near the window when she caught sight of the small family in the back corner. The mother, the older girl, and the little boy who seemed far too quiet for someone his age. She noticed how the mother hesitated before ordering, her voice low and uncertain. Eventually, she asked for 1 grilled cheese sandwich and 3 waters. Haley's eyes dropped to the boy's feet. Her breath caught. The shoes, if they could even be called that, looked worse up close than they had from across the room. The soles were shredded, the fabric split wide at the front. A single rubber band held one shoe together, like a desperate last stitch. His toes peeked out from the holes, raw from cold, and when he shifted, the entire shoe folded back like paper. Haley blinked, trying to focus on the order in her hand. But the image stuck to her like a shadow. She had known that kind of need. Had lived it. Orphaned at 9, she had bounced between foster homes and group facilities until she aged out of the system. She knew what it was like to wear clothes from a donation bin. She remembered the sting of teachers whispering there's no shame in asking for help, while every other kid avoided sitting next to her. She remembered hiding her feet under the desk because her soles had holes. So when she saw that little boy, quiet, trying not to squirm in his tattered sneakers, something inside her twisted. She stepped away from the counter and walked to the back where her coworker Jenna was refilling syrup containers. "Can you cover my section for 10 minutes? Haley asked, already reaching for her coat. Jenna raised an eyebrow. "Where are you going?" "I just need to grab something. I'll be right back." "You okay?" Haley nodded once, briskly. "Yeah. I just need to do something." She ducked into the break room, grabbed her purse, and exited through the side door. The wind bit at her cheeks as she walked quickly down the block. She didn't hesitate, didn't second-guess. She knew exactly where she was going, the discount shoe store 2 streets over, the one that always had a clearance rack near the front. Her fingers were already digging through her wallet, counting what she had. $46. It would be enough. 7 minutes later, she returned through the side door with a plain white paper bag under her arm. She slipped off her coat, tucked the bag behind the counter, and exhaled slowly. Back on the floor, she refilled a few water glasses, dropped off a receipt, and waited for the right moment. The family in the back was still seated, sharing small bites of the sandwich. The boy hadn't spoken a word. Haley approached quietly, kneeling beside the booth so she could look the boy in the eyes. She smiled gently and held out the bag. "These are yours now," she said softly. "No need to thank me. Just run better." The boy's eyes widened, and he looked up at his mother. The woman stared at Haley, stunned. "I can't accept that," she whispered. "You don't even know us." Haley placed a steady hand on the woman's shoulder. "It's already paid for," she said. "No strings. Just let him have a better day." The mother didn't speak. She simply nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. The boy pulled the bag into his lap like it was made of gold. Haley rose to her feet and turned away before her own emotions betrayed her. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that someone had been watching. Not out of curiosity or judgment, but with a silent intensity that only those used to making decisions at the top levels of power possess. From across the room, behind a plain ceramic coffee mug, Richard Delaney had seen the entire thing. The little white box sat quietly in the center of the table, plain and unassuming, yet impossibly heavy with meaning. Haley had placed it there gently, her fingers lingering for just a second longer than necessary before pulling away. "These are yours now," she said, her voice low but steady as she knelt beside the booth. Her eyes met the boy's, and something softened in her expression. "No need to thank me. Just run better. The boy didn't move at first. His hands stayed on the edge of the table, his eyes wide with a mix of confusion and wonder. His sister looked from him to the box, unsure what was happening. Their mother, seated stiffly across from them, blinked in disbelief. "I'm sorry," the woman said, her voice faltering. We can't accept this." Haley reached out and rested a hand gently on her shoulder, not forceful, not pitying, just enough to ground her words. "It's already paid for," she said. "No receipt, no return. Just let him be a kid again." There was a pause, long, delicate, almost sacred. Then the mother's hand moved slowly toward the box, her fingers trembling as she lifted the lid. Inside was a brand-new pair of sneakers, simple, sturdy, and clean. Not flashy, not expensive, but whole, intact, dry. The boy's breath hitched as he leaned closer, his eyes growing rounder by the second. With careful hands, as if they might disappear, he pulled the shoes from the box and placed them in his lap. He didn't smile. He didn't cry. But there was a stillness in him now, a quiet kind of awe that only children feel when something impossibly good happens without warning. Across the restaurant, Richard Delaney had not moved. He sat at his corner booth, coffee cooling in front of him, eyes fixed on the scene with the silent focus of a man who had built his life studying people, investors, board members, suppliers, competitors. But none of them ever moved him the way this waitress just had. He hadn't meant to stare. In fact, he had started his morning fully intending to eat, observe, and leave unnoticed. But this was different. He watched as Haley stood up slowly, gave the boy a small wink, and turned back toward the counter without waiting for thanks or recognition. She didn't look around to see if anyone had noticed. She didn't even seem to care. There was no performance in her kindness, just instinct. Richard exhaled and glanced down at the mug in front of him. Empty. He raised his hand subtly. A young server noticed and came over. "Another coffee, sir?" He nodded. "Black, please." The young server turned away, and Richard's eyes drifted back to Haley, now filling salt shakers behind the counter like nothing had happened. But something had. And it wasn't just the boy who felt it. He looked again at the mother, who was still holding one of the new shoes in her hands, her fingers gently brushing the stitching like she couldn't believe it was real. The sister was helping her little brother untie the rubber band from one of his old shoes. The boy, still mostly silent, pressed the soles of the new sneakers against his chest for a moment before carefully putting them on. Richard wasn't a sentimental man, not anymore. Years of business, politics, and power had taught him to keep emotion at bay, to read data and spreadsheets instead of faces. But now, for reasons he couldn't explain, his chest ached in a way he hadn't felt in a long time. He took a sip of the fresh coffee when it arrived. It was hot, bitter, grounding. Across the room, Haley smiled at a couple celebrating their anniversary and jotted down their dessert order. She didn't glance toward Richard. She had no idea who he was. And yet, she had just made the biggest impression of the morning, without saying more than a few words. The lunch rush had tapered off, and the usual hum of clinking plates and refilled coffee cups had settled into a quieter rhythm. Haley moved between booths like nothing unusual had happened, clearing dishes, wiping counters, checking in with customers. She smiled where it was needed, nodded politely when spoken to. But inside, her thoughts were still with the boy in the corner, now happily swinging his legs in his new shoes. It had been worth it. She was just returning a tray of ketchup bottles to the prep station when she heard her name over the intercom. "Haley, break room. Now please." The voice was unmistakable. Terry, the floor manager. His tone wasn't angry exactly, but it carried the flat edge of someone who didn't appreciate surprises. She exhaled slowly, gave Jenna a quick glance, and headed toward the back. The break room was small and utilitarian, fluorescent lights buzzing softly, a corkboard cluttered with faded schedules, and a stained couch pushed against one wall. Terry was waiting near the employee lockers, arms crossed, a clipboard under one elbow. He didn't look up as she entered. Close the door. Haley did, the click behind her louder than expected. Terry finally turned to face her, adjusting his glasses. He wasn't a bad guy, just someone who cared a little too much about rules and a little too little about people. "I got a call from a customer who said you left the floor during your shift," he began, flipping through the clipboard even though he clearly didn't need it. "You were gone for, what, 7 minutes?" Haley nodded, standing with her hands clasped in front of her. "I asked Jenna to cover my section." "That's not the point," he said sharply. "You don't just leave the floor, Haley. Especially not during lunch service. What if something had happened? What if we'd needed you?" She didn't answer right away. Her eyes drifted to the corkboard, where someone had pinned a flyer for a local food drive. A pair of tiny children's sneakers was drawn on it, cartoonish and bright. "I wasn't on a smoke break," she said quietly. "I wasn't running errands. I saw a kid in this restaurant with shoes that looked like they'd been through a war." Terry sighed, rubbing his temples. "We are not a social service. We're a restaurant. Our job is to take orders, deliver food, and keep the place running. Not play savior." Haley met his eyes for the first time. "I didn't do it to be a savior," she said. "I did it because I couldn't watch him walk out with that pain again." Her voice didn't rise. It didn't tremble. It was calm. Steady. The kind of voice that came not from impulse, but from memory. Terry looked at her for a long moment, his jaw tightening. He shifted his weight and tapped the clipboard against his thigh. "Look, I get it," he muttered. "You're a good person. But good intentions don't cover liability. What if you'd been hurt? What if someone thought we were the ones paying for those shoes? It's a bad look for the company." Haley didn't respond. There was no point. "You're not fired," Terry added after a pause. "But I need to write you up. One more time, and I'll have to escalate." She nodded, still calm. "Okay." He seemed almost surprised by her lack of protest, as if part of him had braced for a fight. When it didn't come, he looked back at his clipboard and scribbled something before handing her a yellow carbon copy. She folded it and placed it in her apron pocket without a word. "You can go," he said. As she opened the door, he spoke once more, quieter this time. "I'm not saying you were wrong. Just, don't make me choose between policy and people again. You won't win." Haley paused at the threshold. She looked over her shoulder, her expression unreadable. "Then maybe it's the policy that needs to lose," she said. And with that, she stepped out into the hallway, the door swinging shut behind her. The rest of Haley's shift passed in a quiet blur. She continued moving from table to table, topping off mugs of coffee, clearing plates, and offering polite smiles that didn't quite reach her eyes. The reprimand from Terry still sat heavy in her chest, not because of the write-up itself, but because of how unsurprised she'd been by it. Good intentions always had consequences. She'd learned that the hard way too many times to count. By mid-afternoon, the lunch crowd had thinned out. A few booths remained occupied by stragglers finishing late meals or lingering over dessert. Haley returned to the counter to refill the sugar caddies and wipe down the surface one last time before her break. That's when she noticed the envelope. It was small and cream-colored, tucked discreetly into the clear tip jar at the edge of the counter. At first, she assumed it was just another folded bill. Some customers, especially the older ones, preferred slipping their tips in paper rather than coins. But as she reached for it, she realized it wasn't money at all. It was far too smooth. Heavy stock. Weighted. She picked it up carefully, her brow furrowing. Her name, Haley, was written on the front in a neat, looping hand. She turned it over and opened the flap. Inside was a single business card. Thick, matte-finished, with a minimalist design. The name printed at the top made her heart catch in her throat. Richard Delaney. Chairman, Delaney Foods. For a moment, the noise of the diner faded. She stared at the card like it might dissolve. She flipped it over slowly, unsure of what she was expecting. A printed mission statement? A coupon? Instead, she found a single handwritten line in clean black ink. I saw the whole thing. Call me if you want to change more than one pair of shoes. She read the message twice, then a third time. Her stomach flipped. She looked up, scanning the dining room instinctively, but the man who had sat in booth 7, the older gentleman with the quiet eyes and calm presence, was gone. The mug he'd been nursing had been cleared. The seat wiped down. There was no trace of him, no coat left behind, no half-empty glass of water. Had he really seen everything? Had he watched her walk across the room, kneel beside that little boy, offer up shoes paid from her own pocket, and not said a word? She held the card tightly, the edges firm against her fingertips. Delaney Foods. Everyone in the industry knew that name. They were one of the biggest players in national food distribution, owning or investing in dozens of brands across the country, from fast casual chains to high-end catering. She'd seen the name printed on the side of delivery trucks, on the back of sauce packets, even on the lids of the ketchup containers in their own kitchen. But what was he doing here? What kind of billionaire sat quietly in a small family diner, anonymous and observant, slipping business cards into tip jars like secrets? She glanced toward the break room, where Terry was now laughing with another manager. He hadn't seen the envelope. Hadn't seen anything, really. But someone had. And for the first time that day, Haley felt something unexpected stir in her chest. Not exhaustion, not frustration, but something that had long been buried under years of keeping her head down. Possibility. Not a promise. Not yet. But something close to it. She tucked the card into her apron pocket, her fingers brushing over the handwriting once more before she let it go. The phone call came 3 days later. Haley was home, folding laundry after putting her daughter, Lily, down for a nap. The sound of her ringtone cut through the quiet of the small apartment. She didn't recognize the number, but something in her gut told her to answer. Hello. Ms. Grant. The voice on the other end was warm, composed, unmistakably confident. This is Richard Delaney. I believe you found my card. She froze for half a second, then stood straighter. Yes. I did. I'd like to buy you a cup of coffee. Nothing formal. Just a conversation. Are you free tomorrow? They met at a quiet cafe on the edge of town, the kind of place with chipped mugs and a chalkboard menu. Richard was already seated when she arrived, dressed simply again, no tie, no assistant, no entourage. Just a man with a purpose. Thank you for coming, he said, rising slightly as she approached. Haley slid into the seat across from him. I have to admit, I didn't think the card was real. Richard smiled. That's fair. Not many people expect their Tuesday shift at a diner to end with a note from a food magnate. They spoke lightly at first, about the restaurant, the weather, her favorite menu item. But soon, the conversation turned. I've been thinking a lot about what I saw that day, Richard said, wrapping his hands around his mug. About the way you handled that moment with the boy. You didn't ask for permission. You didn't make a scene. You just saw a need, and met it. Haley looked down. It wasn't a big deal. It was, he said. To him it was. And to me. She didn't quite know how to respond. Richard leaned forward, his voice lowering with intention. I've spent decades building systems, logistics, funding pipelines, supply chains. I can move millions of dollars in food and goods across the country in under 48 hours. But you know what we're always missing. She waited. Heart. He let the words settle. We've had funds. We've had logistics. What we've lacked is heart. Haley blinked, surprised by the honesty in his voice. I'm launching a new initiative, he continued. It's called Step Forward. The goal is simple: provide new shoes to children in underserved rural communities, distributed through community-based restaurants and local outreach programs. Not just as charity, but as dignity. He paused. And I want you to help lead it. Haley stared at him, unsure if she'd heard correctly. Me? Yes, he said plainly. I need someone who doesn't just understand poverty from a distance. I need someone who's lived it. Someone who doesn't see numbers on a spreadsheet, but faces in a booth. Her throat tightened. I've never worked in nonprofits. I've never coordinated anything. You've coordinated survival, Richard said. Every day. That's more than most of my hires can say. He reached into a leather folder and slid a packet across the table. This is a proposal, he said. We'll start small pilot locations in the Midwest. You'll be our first regional coordinator. Full salary. Benefits. Child care stipend. And more importantly, autonomy. You'll build the team. Train the volunteers. Decide where the shoes go. Haley stared at the folder, but didn't open it. I'm just a waitress, she said quietly. Richard shook his head. No. You're someone who acts. And right now, that's exactly what this needs. They sat in silence for a beat. Outside, a few dry leaves skittered across the sidewalk. The cafe buzzed softly with quiet conversation and the hiss of an espresso machine. Haley finally looked up. What if I say yes and mess it up? Richard smiled, gently. Then we fix it. Together. 3 weeks later, the first official Step Forward event took place in a repurposed community hall just outside Kansas City. The space had once hosted church dinners and bingo nights. Now, it buzzed with volunteers, tables stacked with boxes, and families slowly filing in, guided by handwritten signs and welcoming smiles. The room was bright but modest, the linoleum floor scrubbed clean, paper banners hanging from the walls. At the center, Haley stood beside a display table labeled, Size 11 Youth, Boys. Around her, kids sat on folding chairs trying on sneakers of all colors, their laughter bouncing off the walls like music. She had helped organize it all, every box sorted by size, every sign placed with care, every volunteer trained to greet each child with kindness, not pity. She had arrived early, long before the doors opened, to double-check the setup. It was her first time leading anything beyond a lunch shift, but as she looked around, watching shoes being laced, high-fives exchanged, and parents sighing in relief, she felt, right. This mattered. And somehow, she belonged here. She was crouched beside a table, helping a little girl with Velcro straps, when she felt something, 2 small arms wrapped tightly around her waist from behind. She froze, then turned slowly. It was him. The little boy from the diner. His sandy blonde hair was just as unkempt, his cheeks just as pink, but this time, he wasn't wearing shoes held together by rubber bands. He was wearing a brand new pair of navy blue sneakers, laced snug, soles still spotless. He buried his face against her back, saying nothing, just holding on. Haley blinked hard, her hands stilling mid-motion. She turned, kneeling to face him fully. "Hey there," she whispered. The boy didn't speak. But his eyes said everything. A moment later, his mother appeared, holding the hand of the older sister. She looked tired, but lighter somehow, as if something invisible had been lifted from her shoulders. "He sleeps with them on now," the mother said softly, tears already rising in her eyes. "Won't even take them off at night." Haley felt something in her chest give way, quietly, like a knot finally loosening. She smiled gently, brushing a piece of hair behind the boy's ear. "Well," she said, voice warm, "I guess we'll just have to send him some pajamas to match." They all laughed, a short, quiet laugh, but it filled the space like something sacred. Richard Delaney stood a few steps back, watching. He didn't interrupt. He simply observed, hands in his coat pockets, his eyes taking in the scene before him. Haley didn't notice him right away. She was too focused on the boy, who had now returned to showing off his new sneakers by stomping proudly down the aisle, arms out like airplane wings. It wasn't about the shoes. Not really. It was about the way he walked now, like he belonged in the room. Like he didn't have to hide his feet, or his hope. It was the smallest pair of shoes they'd given out that day. And somehow, it made the biggest difference. In a world full of needs, it's easy to become numb. Easy to say someone else will help, or maybe next time. We pass by broken things and broken people, assuming that someone somewhere will step in. But Haley didn't wait for someone else. She didn't ask whether it was her responsibility. She didn't weigh the cost or consider how it might look. She saw a child in pain, and she moved. Not because it was convenient. Not because it was part of her job. But because no one else had. That's the quiet truth behind real kindness. It doesn't always come from those with the most resources. It comes from those with the most heart. From those who refuse to look away, even when the rest of the world does. And that's why this story stays with us. Because in the end, she didn't buy him shoes because he needed them. She bought them because no one else did. If you've ever wondered whether a small act really matters, remember this. The person receiving it doesn't need something huge. They just need something timely. That moment. That gesture. That kindness. It could be the difference between despair and hope. Between feeling invisible and being seen. So if this story moved you, if you believe that even the smallest kindness can carry someone forward, and in the comments, tell us, when did you do something small that became a turning point for someone else? Because stories like this don't just live on screen. They live in us, all of us, waiting to be shared.